in talking about preservation in the city and monuments and places, I'm reminded that I actually had the opportunity, the honor to speak here at Tulane, thanks in part to an invitation from Tom and Carol Reese a few years ago, and I'd been giving some lectures in the West, trying to mediate between a kind of Western and an Eastern sense of place. And I felt that there was something that at least I understood about both. But when I came here and encountered a city as fascinating and different from anything that I had ever really experienced as New Orleans, I realized that I had very few clues about what the sense of place that made New Orleans tick were. I really did feel like there were new things in life that I didn't understand. And that experience has sort of helped to shape my own attitude to the question of place. In addressing this question, monuments and places, I actually want to change the title a little bit. On the program it says preservation in the city, monuments and places. But I want to revise that to monuments or places. Because I do feel that we face some fundamental challenges, some basic decisions that we need to make in historic preservation. You may, at this moment, be inclined to disagree with me, in part because your experience in New Orleans doesn't make that sound true. You've been so successful in doing both, in riding both horses, and having wonderfully preserved monuments and, of course, one of the earliest historic districts designated in the country. And you now have a preservation movement here, which is really in the forefront of thinking about preservation in terms of neighborhoods throughout the city. But bear with me, because I'm speaking really about other parts of the country, my own city, New York, which I know a little bit better, but also I want to push the thinking about place just a little bit further. Maybe I should start by telling you what I mean by place, but actually maybe I won't do that, because the fact is that there is, and one of the problems for us is that there is no widely accepted definition of what place is or what the word place means. Which also means that many of our favorite phrases, like sense of place and spirit of place, actually are almost meaningless, because they can mean anything that we want them to. And I won't bore you with a recitation of the many, many definitions that have come out, the thinking about place from fields ranging from real estate through cultural geography, through anthropology, through history, to social psychiatry, except as a way to suggest what some of the issues at stake are, to refer to a well-known social psychiatrist named Mindy Fully Love Thompson, and to give you the three definitions that she gives of place. First, she says, place is a location or setting for events. Second, place stands for human interactions that occur at a given location. Third, she says, place represents the nodes of each person's individual life biography. So according to these definitions, place is something that sustains individual lives, provides necessary services ranging from shelter and security through social acceptance and individual affirmation. Now, what's striking about Thompson's definitions is how different they are from the kind of dialogue that we usually have in the historic preservation community. These ways of looking at place are really not very well represented, let us say, in the National Register criteria. They're probably not referred to in the designation documents for the French Quarter here. But I would guess that if New Orleans is anything like New York, these ways of looking at place do come up in the way people talk about the places they live, and maybe even in the kinds of public testimony that people offer at hearings, because they do represent important, if incomplete, truths about people and places. Now, to be clear, I'm not for a minute suggesting that the kinds of things that we think are important, architecture, aesthetic quality, historical significance, don't matter in terms of defining place. I think that one of the contributions that we can make as preservationists is to get into the dialogues that people are having in other fields and explain why these things actually do matter to people. But nonetheless, Mindy Fulilov's formulation really does represent a significant challenge to us. And the challenge, I think, is simply this, that we need to figure out how much of what she calls place is actually the same thing that we call heritage. Because whatever fits, whatever crosses that line, whatever falls within our broad definition of heritage becomes our responsibility to think about and act on. And if we are willing to take on board that kind of much broader, more humanistic way of thinking about what people derive from place, how people become attached to places, what people need from places, then that's going to change our practice and our attitudes, whether as preservation professionals or civic advocates. In concluding, I can be concrete, at least about a couple of the implications that I think this way of looking at place might have for us. Fulilov's first definition of place, location where things happen, points, among other things, to people's basic physical needs, the things we need from places: homes, jobs, food, a place to buy toothpaste, and so forth. So how are our urban communities doing from this perspective? Well, urban neighborhoods, US cities, have been in collapse, in crisis for 40 years. It's a crisis of shrinkage, of abandonment of property, of vacancy. Even before Katrina, between 1960 and 2000, New Orleans had lost 25% of its population. That's typical of many, many cities around the country. And what happens when cities shrink, it's not just New Orleans, is that neighborhoods, long-established neighborhoods, become unsustainable. Buildings are vacated, people leave, the neighborhood dies. There's no way to sustain them. This, of course, is the problem of urban shrinkage, of course, is one that you've been dealing with in a very acute way since Katrina here in New Orleans. But in fact, as I said, it's a national problem. We encountered it in a very serious way in New York in the 1970s and 80s when the population of the city shrank from 8 million to 7 million, and it was a huge crisis. So if as preservationists we're prepared to choose places over monuments, then one of the things we need to do is be willing to get up to our necks in a bunch of civic issues that don't immediately look like heritage or preservation issues. Municipal finance, politics, jobs, economy, but above all, equity. Because these really are heritage issues. These neighborhoods are the places that sustain and perpetuate a fundamental heritage of urban living in this country. And these factors are the ones that are making it, are going to determine whether that heritage can survive or not. So this is very much an issue for us. The second question that I want to pose in making this, the choice about place more explicit concerns the dimension of individual affirmation that Mindy Fulilove believes good places provide for people. That way that feeling attached to places has for us of making us feel somehow completed and centered as a person. To some extent, that dimension comes from a functioning community. And I think that probably Dan and Erica and Stanley will all talk more about that. But it also comes from a very personal identification with places. And that poses a puzzle for us. Preservation on one level is about shared values and public process. So how do we get a grip on this very individual and often very secret way that people have of forming attachment to places? And how do we translate that into a preservation process that, that's based on shared values, that produces reasonably predictable, consistent, and equitable decisions? So to sum up, in the spirit of raising questions today, I would just like to raise these two, to suggest that these are two of the questions that the decision between focusing on monuments or focusing on places pose for us. One, what more can preservation do to break out of our own professional isolation and to become a productive partner in the larger ongoing struggle for healthy and equitable urban communities in this country? And two, how can we become more receptive to the elusive but important personal connections that people have with places, and that have a lot, but we don't know exactly what or how much, to do with people's personal sense of place?
Let me ask this. I don't know that anybody here would disagree with what you've asked, what you've posed, but the question I raise in the discussion that I made is one of definition. Is this graspable? Do people understand this? Are there communities where this is fully embraced? Real places where people understand what you're talking about in the preservation movement and not only accept it but are actively engaged under that definition?
You're asking me?
Well, I'm asking the group.
I feel like I've talked too much.
No, but, I'm asking the group.
Well, then I'll take it. You take the rest.
I think that it's perhaps not grasped as part of the preservation movement, but it's grasped as the way in which people live their lives in place. And I think what Ned is perhaps arguing persuasively, or at least raising, is that preservation actually has to start coming to terms more fully with the way in which real people value real places in their everyday life. And I think for a long time, and if you look at preservation regulations, the strongest vestige of another approach to places is that we regulate places as if we're curators of the built environment, that our greatest aspiration is to have one great example of every style. And I think that increasingly that's an arid cul-de-sac for preservation to be moving into. And Bob, I jotted down, you know, this is something that people tend to talk about when they talk about preservation. You talked about the creme de la creme when you were talking about the modernist things. And what my take on your discussion of the modern movement buildings is that you want to squeeze another style into the lexicon of what preservationists are willing to take hold of. And I think that and I know that that's not the only thing that you're seeing, but it's very much there, that Art Deco is easy to love. It's a relationship between people and styles that's part of a professional discourse. We're not the curator, or we ought not to be the curators, and yet we have a regulatory apparatus that informs preservation that's very much about, it's the building equivalent of bird watching. We want to have a bird watching book that identifies each style, and we want to make sure we've seen it, and then we want to make sure that it's sustained in some way and is around. And I think that what Ned is at least throwing down as a challenge, and I think framing it as monuments or places is a provocative way of getting at that, is that we're missing a huge amount of the way in which people actually relate to place. And that we need to start learning from what people do in their everyday lives. I was actually, I was recently on a Alzheimer and dementia unit, and outside of all of the residents' rooms, there's a memory box that is to help the residents ground themselves in some recall of their place. And it's interesting, very few of the elements in these memory boxes are iconic buildings. You know, they're pictures of weddings, they're pictures of children and graduations. All of those events were situated in place, but they're not quite understood, perhaps, in the way that we might understand place, as something that grounds people. Even though, as I say, there's a spatial component of all of those, of people's weddings, of their graduations, of their lives and their communities. All of those have a spatial dimension. And yet, preservationists would sort of look past that. And I'm thinking, there's a lot to be learned from the way in which people slipping into Alzheimer's and dementia take hold of their world and recall the things that are worth recalling.
Keep going.
I'll add a personal anecdote of my own to what Daniel just said. Having worked in the preservation field for a number of years, I went back to do a Ph.D. in planning and public policy. And in sitting down with one of my planning professors and talking about my research interests, he posed the question, well, are you interested in people or places?
Yes.
And I said, well, I'm interested in the nexus of people and places. I'm interested in what that relationship is, the processes that form around this. And he goes, well, good luck with that.
How are things going with that?
Well, my dissertation's not done, and he is on my committee, so.
We'll find out how things are going.
So, and it does pose an interesting challenge, because I think Daniel has hit upon this concept of a curatorial tradition in the field, deriving a lot from connoisseurship. And everywhere we go, and I'll actually throw in a tidbit from last night, learning about New Orleans, everywhere I go, and having worked internationally, you always hear, well, we need an inventory. We need to know what we have. We need a database. We need to be able to record all these things. We need an inventory. And unfortunately, particularly in lesser developed areas of the world, you see these inventories get underway, but then you don't have the resources to update them, and you don't have the resources to maintain them, or the software doesn't translate over time. And so there's always a lot of questions that come around this idea of, well, why do we have to know all of this information? Why do we need to know exactly what's there when what is there is constantly changing? And what was interesting to me was I heard last night about a terrific database project here in New Orleans. And for the first time ever, I heard about how, well, what we want to do is make it an open platform. We want to put it online so that individuals can add to that record and put their mark and their opinion on the information about their building or a building that's part of their memory. And I thought, wow. That's the first time I've ever encountered this. And it suggests much more of that relationship between people and place and the responsibility of really engaging.
Yeah, I think that's part of the answer to Bob's question. Are there places where this is happening? It's something that we actually tried to do late in the 1990s in New York. But there's also a project in Austin now where they're setting up a wiki that will do very much the same thing. So actually technology, I'm actually hopeful that opposition that you ran into between people and places, that we're at a moment of flexibility where we can begin to get past that. But I want to take up the inventory issue for a minute. Supposing we say inventories themselves aren't the problem. The question is what we inventory. And one of the problems with inventories is that they always start out by looking at things. And when you start out by looking at things, you only catch the ones that are, that reveal their importance visually. Supposing we started another way and said, we're going to take an inventory of stories. We're just going to collect stories that people tell about places. Well, that would give us a very different map of resources at the end of our inventory than the map of visually recognized monuments. But, you know, maybe it's still worth doing.
Part of what you're describing, though, let me just provoke here, is a greater engagement of the communities themselves. And part of the question there is who defines the community and what does the community consist of? Is it self-defining? And, or is it something that people comment on from outside that community? You raise technology. Physical location is irrelevant. One does not have to live in a place to be to comment on it, to blog about it, to think about it, to offer advice. I may be a preservationist in New York with an opinion about what should happen in New Orleans. Please talk. What do you think about it? What does that mean? Is it place specific or is it not?
I'll take a first stab at that. I think that part of what you said about our living in a connected world now is relevant here. As a New Yorker, I don't fully own the Brooklyn Bridge. You all have a share of ownership in the Brooklyn Bridge. And a local example, similar to the one you mentioned in China, concerned the renovation of Lever House back in the 1990s, a world-renowned example of modernism. One of the things that swayed the Landmarks Commission's views was getting letters from all over the world from people who felt that they shared some ownership in Lever House. So I don't actually think that you have to live in a place to feel connected to it. But I do think that the residents of places are the primary, first of all, they're the primary resource for understanding it. They are, people who live in places are the major experts in the place. And also they're the people who really most depend on them. So they are the people that we need to, we always need to start and end with residents, I think.
Yeah, Jorge.
Morning. I think as we shy away from the idea of preservation, pursuing the identification of relevant buildings or styles, I think that when we deal with policy making, laws, advocacy, the real role of the preservationist is that of a translator. And I think even when you think of a website where people just put their comments up, I think we cannot actually do away with our duty to tell people how these things connect and what they mean. So if you go to a community, you just don't look to, you just don't go there to look at the great building, but also you can help articulate what is that sense of place. I do think people understand what place is. That's why they keep the mementos, that's why they remember, and that's why they feel sorry when things change. But the preservationist needs to articulate, and those translations are, in a way, as thorough as we are in our job, we have to cheat as translators because the politician wants one translation, the local people wants one translation, and we can do that without betraying anything, but I would not just put it on the people to interpret it on their own because the collective sense can be identified by many people. In that sense, I don't think it's site-specific. I think it's great when you travel and you go to places and you make questions, because somehow being removed gives you some immediacy that some people don't get. Yesterday we were driving around the Holy Cross district, and I noticed these markings on the houses, and they're on all the houses. Nobody mentioned what these were. And I had remembered these were the FEMA markings, but I could not understand what those numbers or words are, and I had to ask. Now, I think this is what our job is, to notice recurrences, to ask questions, and then let other people enrich that with their own points of view.
I think we have in our grasp methods that tease out narratives of place that maybe people haven't quite taken measure of. I'm not asking that we suspend expertise or insight, but one of the things that we need to be experts in is listening and looking with new eyes, but it's not a question of suspending and saying, well, there's no story, and I'll talk about this a little bit in the next segment. I mean, we in dealing with bungalow neighborhoods in Chicago, you know, we're looking at them in ways that weren't everyday ways of looking at them, and yet people valued them and then rolled that into their narratives of place. There's a way, there's actually a dialogue, I think, there. I wanted, before we stray too far from the initial question of monuments or memory, and I know this is really dangerous, but I'm relieved that the real full-throated participation of the audience won't come till after lunch. And that is, I know very little about preservation in New Orleans. I did follow with interest, at least through the pages of, or one page of the New York Times, 2.5 years ago, the discussion of the Holy Cross School moving into the Gentilly neighborhood. And the New York Times actually has a penchant for making preservationists look kind of ridiculous. And I think that if you want to talk this monument, the way in which that issue was being framed was largely in the way that Bob Ivy was talking about our needing to develop a taste for squeezing modern movement buildings into the canon of preservation. And the church, Xavier Church, right, on the site that they were moving. Cabrini. Okay, right. See, I don't have a great recall, but the argument was being made that the reason that that building had to be saved was that it was a great example and a rare example of modern movement architecture. And I think that probably resonates with a fair number of people in this room. Does it resonate with a fair number of people in the city? Does it resonate with politicians? And I began envisioning what would it have looked like to make an argument about that building that said that since whenever it was built, 1960s, 62, 63, that so many 1,000, 1,500 weddings were consummated in that space. What would it look like to say that this is a place where so many communions had been taken over the years? What would it say to begin to imagine the way in which that building fit not into the architectural lexicon of modern movement buildings, but into the deeper, richer social fabric of the people that had lived and used that particular parish? I don't know whether that would have begun, but the combination of that with an argument about its style, with an argument about whether or not it was just obscenely wasteful in the context of a high school program that has a cafeteria, an auditorium, a gymnasium, large public spaces that could very well have been provided less expensively by grabbing onto the built form of that building, and complement the arguments that were being made about style. You might have actually been able to go out to the Holy Cross School construction site and found a very different scene than what you travel to and see when you go out there today. So I'll float that out as
and let me follow that reasoning with you just a bit, and that is, and that's that question of monument, which is central to the discussion right now. And that is, would you have made that same argument if it were an ordinary building, a building of questionable authenticity or architectural worth? Would that same combination of discussions apply? Would you want to do so? I mean, isn't there some sort of need for evaluation, or what we've termed as contributing for so long? I mean, please talk about that.
I'm looking at this discussion somewhat differently.
Okay.
I really am. I come from community economic development, community revitalization, and putting people first. I approach preservation with people first, building second. And the reason I do that is because the place in which they live has such an sometimes indescribable process, if you will, about how they will live. People who live in public housing, for example, in their definition of place. People who live in low to moderate income communities in their definition of place. People who live in suburbs in their definition of place will have different meanings at different times. I come to preservation because in '68 Martin Luther King got killed and was assassinated, and it changed forever. The place I grew up in, which was a predominantly white neighborhood. Overnight, it became an African-American neighborhood, and that was repeated time and time again across this country, and it redefined, in many instances, the sense of place. And I grew up in an era in which that sense of place was one in which I was taught because people went to the suburbs. Perhaps then it would be better for me to agree with the United States government and have an urban renewal program that says demolish this neighborhood because it's worthless, and we ought to build suburbia in the inner city. There are often conflicting views about place based upon who says what and who does what. But for me, at the end of the day, in the communities I come from, it's cash is king. It's who has the most money to influence the decisions and the behaviors in such a way that it ultimately affects our lives. One other point to that. I used to run a public housing authority, and my golden rule was do no harm. My golden rule was to the least of these. In running public housing, I used to say to the workers, if your mother and father couldn't sleep here tonight, you didn't do a good enough job. But what does that have to do with the preservation? It has a great deal to do with a sense, in my mind, of place. How do you talk to a resident about keeping a building in public housing and they've never heard the word historic preservation? How do you do that? How do we have a conversation today and not discuss the white elephant in the room? How do we do that? The white elephant in the room for me is where the rest of the African Americans, where the rest of the community that we need to be inclusive about to have this discussion. He asked me, don't I have anything to say? I have a lot to say, but I approach it somewhat differently. I approach it from the point of view of preservationists, and a lot of us, who make plans about neighborhoods and are clueless about how we're going to pay for it. Absolutely clueless. Let me just stop there. I mean, preservation is a very real thing to me. When I went to Georgetown, when a preservationist, because I beat up the first preservationist I ever met, his name was Arthur Ziegler. When a preservationist said to me, it is meaningful, and I saw people moving to the suburbs, and he realized he could not communicate with me, and he put a bus in front of me, and he said, let's go to Annapolis, let's go to Georgetown. Do you know what it's like for a 21-year-old kid to be standing in the middle of Georgetown in Washington, D.C., and being told it was formerly an African-American neighborhood? For me, it converted me for life. It gave me an understanding that the sense of place I lived in was unique, and that we could challenge behavior differently. I'm sorry.
Okay. Any further comments from the panel?
Are we out of time?
No, we're
Because
fine.
I did want to follow up. Actually, I was hoping that we could turn, and we've talked about some of the kind of personal connection issues and getting, but I wondered if there's time to talk a little about the social equity issues of place that I think Stanley has reminded us of usefully. No, I don't have anything to say about it. No, I was hoping somebody else would. Somebody must have.
Do you mean the social equity of people's access to beauty and architecture?
No, I mean, no. I mean the question of where preservation fits into the larger question of the survival and sustainability of urban neighborhoods in this country, which do face far more serious problems than whether a particular church or school will stand or not.
You know, we raised a question earlier about cities coming back, given the cost of energy, given the cost of so much, the repopulation of our cities. New Orleans is going through the repopulation process right now, and you're thinking through a lot of critical decisions, And a lot of the critical decisions that you are making here will have major impact around this country. There are many cities that are going to be going through what you're going through. The leadership that you have with the National Trust and PRC and other leaders going through this process is going to be invaluable. As the inner city begins to change, or as our cities begin to change, one of the dynamics that we're going to have to constantly think about is, what will tomorrow look like for preservation? And who will have the skin in the game to be in that discussion? You never hear the term preservation in the hip-hop generation. You never hear the term preservation in the hip-hop generation. You should. We never really get down to the meat of the discussion about how preservation is inclusive and who it is inclusive of and why it needs to be inclusive. So when we talk about, for me, the social fabric piece of this, it involves all of us. One of the greatest sea changes in preservation happened this month. It did.
I know.
And he reminded me. For those of you in the audience don't know, when we were planning, and sometimes I just shouldn't say, but I'm going to say, we were alerted to Charity Hospital, for example, and the concerns that people are raising about Charity Hospital. And in the old day, I used to be a community organizer. And I came to appreciate that, as I was talking with my friend, that Michelle Obama was on the Landmarks Commission in Chicago. So I called her. Called her on the phone. Just got the White House number and called her. Now you're wondering, did I talk to her? Preservationists had to connect the dots. Well, I'm not going to tell you whether or not I talked to her. Because I'm going to invite you to call her as well. I guess what I'm saying is we begin to think about this whole issue of social change. Who will our new partners be?